In the vast expanse of the Andromeda Galaxy, where 12 different alien species bow before the throne of the most beautiful being in existence, Princess Zaratiel has rejected over 10,000 marriage proposals. Her beauty is legendary: skin that shimmers like liquid starlight, eyes that hold the depth of nebulae, and a voice that can make entire fleets surrender without firing a shot. For 3 centuries, she has turned away emperors, war heroes, brilliant scientists, and even gods from distant realms. Each rejection has been swift, merciless, and absolute. The galaxy whispers that her heart is made of the same cold metal as her throne, untouchable and unbreakable. But what happens when a species that wasn't supposed to exist anymore sends their most unlikely ambassador? What happens when a human, a member of a race the galaxy believes went extinct 1,000 years ago, walks into her court wearing nothing but confidence and a crooked smile? The princess who has never felt her heart skip a beat is about to discover that sometimes the most powerful force in the universe isn't technology, magic, or royal blood. Sometimes it's the stubborn, impossible, beautiful audacity of humanity. This is the story of how one human didn't just steal a heart, he stole the heart that was never supposed to be stolen, and, in doing so, changed the fate of the entire galaxy. The throne room of eternity stretched out like a crystalline cathedral, its walls pulsing with the soft blue light of captured stars. Princess Zaratiel sat upon her throne of living diamond, each facet reflecting not just light, but the hopes and dreams of billions across 12 worlds. Her silver hair cascaded down her shoulders like liquid mercury, and her violet eyes held the cold beauty of distant supernovas. She was magnificent, terrible, and utterly untouchable. The morning brought its usual parade of hopefuls. First came Lord Kethvar of the Crimson Nebula, his 4 arms bearing gifts of impossible value: a star captured in crystal, a song from the first dawn, and the tears of a dying galaxy. He knelt before her with the grace of someone who had conquered 1,000 worlds, his red skin gleaming with ceremonial oils. "Your Majesty," his voice rumbled like distant thunder, "I offer not just my devotion, but the combined fleets of 7 star systems. Together, we could rule." "No." The word fell from her lips like a closing door. She didn't even look at his gifts. "Guard Captain Marcel, please escort Lord Kethvar to the departure bay. His shuttle is waiting." The alien lord's face twisted in disbelief. "But, Your Majesty, you haven't even heard my full proposal. I conquered the void serpents for you. I gathered the tears of Andromeda." Zaratiel's expression remained as unmoved as space itself. "I have heard enough marriage proposals to fill a library. Yours sounds remarkably similar to proposals 3000 through 3050. Your accomplishments are noted and dismissed. Good day." The guards moved forward, their ceremonial weapons catching the starlight. Lord Kethvar allowed himself to be led away, but not before casting a look of wounded pride over his shoulder. The princess had already forgotten he existed. The second suitor was Prince Felfon of the Crystal Moons, whose transparent skin revealed the constellation of lights that served as his nervous system. He had traveled for 2 years through hyperspace to reach her, composing mathematical poems that could allegedly prove his love through quantum equations. He never made it past his opening line. "No." The third was High Commander Zexila, a warrior goddess whose very presence made the air crackle with barely contained energy. Her proposal came in the form of a challenge, a duel that would prove their compatibility through combat. The princess didn't even dignify this with a verbal response, merely raising one perfectly sculpted eyebrow. By noon, 17 suitors had been rejected. By evening, 31. Each rejection was swifter than the last, each dismissal more absolute. The court whispers grew louder with each departed hopeful. Some said the princess's heart had frozen to absolute zero during the Great War. Others claimed she was waiting for a suitor who could match her impossible standards, someone who could offer her something she had never seen before. What none of them knew, what none of them could have possibly known, was that Zaratiel had stopped listening to proposals after the first 100. Every word that followed had become white noise, a meaningless parade of power and wealth and promises she had heard countless times before. She had built walls around her heart that were stronger than the metal of her throne, and she had convinced herself that nothing in the known universe could breach them. The final audience of the day was announced just as the artificial suns of her palace began to dim. "Your Majesty," spoke Advisor Peldar, his blue skin flickering with nervous patterns, "there is one more request for an audience. However, the subject is unusual. How unusual. Zaratiel's voice carried the weight of 3 centuries of boredom. The individual claims to represent a species that our records indicate has been extinct for over a millennium. He says he represents humanity. For the first time in decades, something flickered behind the princess's eyes. Humanity. She had heard stories, of course. Every civilized being in the galaxy had heard the legends. They were the ghost stories that parents told their children, tales of a violent, impossible species that had supposedly burned their own world and vanished from the galaxy before anyone else had achieved faster than light travel. Most scholars agreed they had never existed at all, that they were simply a convenient myth to explain certain unexplained phenomena in the outer rim. Ancient ruins with technology that didn't match any known species. Wreckages of ships built with materials that shouldn't have been possible with primitive technology. Radio signals that spelled out mathematical constants in a base-10 system no civilized species used. Send him in, she said, her curiosity finally outweighing her cosmic-level boredom. This should be entertaining. The great doors of the throne room opened, their crystal panels sliding apart with the sound of singing glass. Through them walked a figure that made every head in the court turn. He was tall, but not unusually so by galactic standards. His skin was a warm brown that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and his hair was darkened, cut short in a style that no one had seen before. He wore simple clothes, dark blue fabric that seemed sturdy but unremarkable, and boots that showed signs of actual wear. No ceremonial armor, no flowing robes, no technology that screamed of wealth or power. But it was his eyes that caught everyone's attention. They were dark brown, almost black, and they held something that the princess had never seen in any of her previous suitors' gazes. Not awe. Not desire. Not even respect. They held curiosity. He walked forward with an easy confidence, his steps echoing in the vast space. He didn't kneel. He didn't bow. He simply stopped a respectful distance from the throne and looked up at her with those impossible dark eyes. Princess Zaratiel, he said, and his voice was like nothing she had ever heard. It was warm and rough around the edges, like it had been shaped by laughter and arguments rather than court training. My name is Marcus Chen, and I represent the human colonial fleet. We've been watching your little marriage market from the outer rim, and I've got to say, I'm impressed by your efficiency. The court erupted in shocked whispers. No one spoke to the princess like that. No one had ever dared to refer to the sacred ritual of courtship as a marriage market. Several guards moved forward, hands on their weapons, but Zaratiel held up a hand to stop them. She was studying this strange being with the intensity of a scientist examining a new form of life. He didn't look like the myths described humans. Those stories spoke of giants with skin like molten metal and voices that could shatter mountains. This creature was almost disappointingly ordinary, except for the fact that he was standing in her throne room speaking as casually as if they were meeting at some kind of social gathering. Human colonial fleet, she repeated, tasting the words. I was under the impression that your species was extinct. Marcus Chen smiled, and it transformed his entire face. It wasn't the practiced smile of a courtier or the hungry grin of a conqueror. It was genuine amusement, tinged with something that might have been mischief. Yeah, we get that a lot. Turns out, reports of our extinction were greatly exaggerated. We've been out in the dark between galaxies, building, learning, growing. And now we're back, and I've got a proposal for you. The princess leaned forward slightly, the first movement she had made all day that wasn't purely ceremonial. Another marriage proposal? Oh, hell no, Marcus said, and several courtiers gasped at his language. With all due respect, Your Majesty, I wouldn't marry you if you came with a fleet of starships and your own galaxy. No offense. The silence that followed was so complete that the only sound was the soft humming of the starlights in the walls. In 300 years, no one, absolutely no one, had ever told Princess Zaratiel that they wouldn't marry her. The very concept was like suggesting that gravity might decide to flow upward. But, instead of fury, instead of ordering his immediate execution, the princess found herself doing something she hadn't done in living memory. She laughed. It started as a small sound, barely more than a breath, but it grew into something bright and surprised and completely genuine. The court stared in shock as their Ice Queen princess threw back her head and laughed like she had just heard the most surprising joke in the universe. "I'm sorry," Marcus said, though he didn't look sorry at all. "I probably should have led with that. I'm not here to ask for your hand. I'm here to offer you something else entirely." "And what?" she asked, wiping a tear from her eye. "Could you possibly offer me that 10,000 other suitors have not?" Marcus Chen looked around the throne room, taking in the impossible architecture, the courtiers dressed in their finest clothes, the guards with their ceremonial weapons, the advisor who was frantically checking his datapad to see if refusing a royal marriage proposal was some kind of executable offense. Then, he looked back at the princess, this beautiful, untouchable being who had never been told no, who had never been surprised, who had built her entire existence around the certainty that she was the most desirable being in the known universe. "I can offer you a mystery," he said simply. "I can offer you the one thing you've never had before. I can offer you the chance to be wrong about something." For the first time in 3 centuries, Princess Zaratiel felt her heart skip a beat. The court held its breath, waiting for her response, waiting to see how their princess would handle this impossible breach of protocol. But Zaratiel was barely aware of their presence. She was studying this strange human with new eyes, seeing not just his casual confidence or his unexpected refusal, but something deeper. He was looking at her like she was a person instead of a prize. Like she was someone to talk with instead of someone to win. Like she was interesting rather than just beautiful. "Explain," she said, her voice softer than it had been all day. "The universe is full of mysteries, princess. Dark matter, quantum consciousness, the reason why hyperspace exists at all. But you've lived your entire life having every question answered before you could ask it, every desire fulfilled before you could want it. You know everything about running an empire, but when's the last time you learned something completely new? When's the last time you failed at something? When's the last time someone told you that you were wrong?" She considered this, her violet eyes never leaving his face. "And you believe you can provide these experiences?" "I believe you can provide them for yourself," Marcus said. "I'm just offering to show you how. My people have a saying, the most interesting conversations happen when you disagree with someone who's smarter than you are. I'm pretty sure you're smarter than me, princess. The question is, are you brave enough to find out if I'm right?" The throne room was so quiet that the sound of her heartbeat seemed to echo off the crystal walls. Around them, the court waited, watching this unprecedented moment unfold. No one moved. No one breathed. Princess Zaratiel, who had rejected emperors and war gods, who had turned away gifts that could buy solar systems, who had built her entire existence around being untouchable and unattainable, looked at this impossible human who had strolled into her court and challenged everything she thought she knew about herself. And, for the first time in 300 years, she felt alive. "Marcus Chen of the Human Colonial Fleet," she said formally, her voice carrying to every corner of the vast room, "I accept your proposal. Not for marriage, but for mystery. You may stay as my guest for 1 lunar cycle. We will see what develops." As the court erupted in shocked whispers and her advisors frantically began calculating the diplomatic implications, Zaratiel allowed herself another smile. She was looking forward to being wrong about something. She had no idea how spectacularly wrong she was about to be about everything. The guest quarters assigned to Marcus Chen were designed to impress visiting dignitaries from the most powerful civilizations in the galaxy. The walls were made of crystallized time itself, showing glimpses of moments from the past and future like windows into other realities. The furniture was grown from living coral that responded to thought, reshaping itself to provide perfect comfort. The view looked out onto the hanging gardens of infinity, where plants from 1,000 worlds grew in impossible geometric patterns that spelled out poetry in languages that had no words. Marcus took one look around the opulent space and immediately began rearranging everything. "What are you doing?" asked Peldar, the advisor who had been assigned to watch over their unusual guest. His blue skin was flickering with patterns that indicated severe confusion. "Making it livable," Marcus replied, pushing a chair made from crystallized music over to face the window. "All this stuff is beautiful, but it's not very practical. Where am I supposed to put my things? Where am I supposed to work?" "Work?" Peldar's pattern shifted to alarm. "You are a guest of the princess. You are not expected to work. Your every need will be anticipated and fulfilled before you realize you have it. Marcus paused in his rearranging to look at the advisor with genuine curiosity. That sounds absolutely terrible. How do you get anything done if someone else is always doing it for you? This question broke something fundamental in Palvar's understanding of the universe. He stammered for several moments, his skin cycling through colors that had no meaning because no one had ever needed to express this particular type of cognitive dissonance before. You do understand who you are speaking to, he managed finally. Princess Zaratiel is the most powerful being in 12 star systems. She commands fleets that could turn planets to dust with a thought. She has wealth that could buy and sell entire civilizations. She is beauty incarnate, wisdom personified, power absolute. And she has chosen to extend her hospitality to you personally. This is the highest honor that any being in the known galaxy could possibly receive. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. She seems nice. Very attractive, obviously. Good sense of humor once you get past the whole untouchable ice queen thing. But, honestly? I'm more interested in her library than her throne room. Palvar's skin went completely white, which in his species indicated either total shock or impending death. Her library? She mentioned yesterday that she's been alive for 3 centuries. That's a lot of time to accumulate knowledge. I'm curious about what she's learned, how she thinks, what problems she's tried to solve. The throne room told me she's powerful, but power isn't really that interesting by itself. It's what you do with it that matters. The advisor sat heavily on a chair that immediately reshaped itself to support his sagging form. In 30 years of diplomatic service, he had never encountered a being who was interested in the princess's mind rather than her crown. The concept was so foreign that his brain kept refusing to process it. Perhaps, he said weakly, you would like to rest? The journey from the outer rim must have been exhausting. Actually, I was hoping to explore a bit. Maybe visit that library I mentioned? Or better yet, is there somewhere the princess goes when she's not holding court? I'd love to see what she does when she's not being surrounded by people who want things from her. Palvar made a sound that might have been laughter if laughter could express existential terror. The princess does not have private time. Her schedule is managed to the microsecond. Every moment of her day serves the Empire. That's what I thought, Marcus said, and there was something sad in his voice. No wonder she looked so bored yesterday. When's the last time she did something just because she wanted to? Wanting to do something is not really a concept that applies to royalty of her level. She does what is required. Marcus turned to face the advisor fully, and Palvar was struck again by those dark eyes that seemed to see too much. That's not living, that's just existing. No wonder she's never found anyone interesting enough to marry. How can you fall in love with someone if you don't know who you actually are underneath all the ceremony? I think I need to report this conversation to the princess's security detail. Sure, Marcus said easily. While you're at it, ask her if she'd like to join me for dinner tonight. Nothing formal, no ceremony, no court. Just 2 people having a conversation. Palvar fled. An hour later, the princess's private communicator chimed with an incoming message from her advisor. She was in her study, reviewing trade agreements with the Spiral Confederation, when his panicked face appeared in the holographic display. Your Majesty, I must report that our human guest is either completely insane or operating according to a cultural framework that I cannot begin to understand. Zaratiel set down her stylus and leaned back in her chair. Explain. He has rearranged his quarters. He has expressed interest in your library rather than your treasure vaults. He has asked about your private activities and suggested that your lifestyle is somehow insufficient. And he has requested an informal dinner meeting with no court protocols. The princess was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. He wants to have dinner with me. Yes, Your Majesty, but not a state dinner. He specifically requested no ceremony, no formal protocols. I believe he wants to talk to you. As equals. Another pause. As equals. I know it sounds impossible, Your Majesty, but tell him I accept. I'm sorry, Your Majesty, I thought you said I accept his invitation. Arrange for dinner to be served in the East Garden at sunset. Informal service. No guards, no courtiers, no ceremonial anything. But, Your Majesty, security protocols require. Are you concerned that one unarmed human poses a threat to someone who can reshape matter with her thoughts? Well, no, but, then, arrange the dinner, Peldar. And, stop looking so terrified. It's just a conversation. But, as she cut the connection, Zaratiel found herself staring at her reflection in the darkened screen. When had she last eaten a meal that wasn't a diplomatic function? When had she last spoken to someone who wanted nothing from her except her company? She couldn't remember. The East Garden was the smallest of the palace's outdoor spaces, designed for quiet contemplation rather than grand ceremonies. As the artificial suns began to set, casting long shadows between the crystalline trees, Marcus found himself genuinely impressed by the princess's choice of location. It was beautiful without being overwhelming, peaceful without being sterile. He had spent the afternoon exploring what portions of the palace Peldar had been willing to show him, and every room told the same story: incredible wealth, impossible beauty, and absolutely no trace of personal preferences or individual personality. It was like touring a museum of someone else's life. The princess arrived exactly at sunset, but she looked different than she had in the throne room. Gone were the flowing robes and ceremonial jewelry. Instead, she wore a simple dress of deep blue fabric that seemed to capture and hold starlight. Her silver hair was pulled back in a practical style, and her feet were bare. She looked, Marcus realized, like a person instead of a symbol. "Thank you for joining me," he said, rising from the small table that had been set between two flowering trees. "This is beautiful. I designed this garden myself," she said, and then looked surprised, as if she hadn't meant to share that information. "Really? What was your inspiration?" She hesitated, clearly not accustomed to discussing her personal choices with virtual strangers. There was a planet I visited once during a diplomatic mission. A small world on the outer rim, not strategically important, but they had gardens where people went to think. I found the concept appealing." Marcus smiled as he held out her chair. "So you built your own thinking space?" "I suppose I did." She seated herself gracefully, but he could see the uncertainty in her eyes. "I must confess, I'm not entirely sure how to proceed. I have never had a meal that wasn't part of some formal protocol." "Easy," Marcus said, settling across from her. "You talk about whatever comes to mind. Ask questions. Tell stories. Argue about things. That's what dinner conversations are for." "Argue?" The concept seemed to genuinely confuse her. Disagree. Challenge each other's ideas. Try to figure out who's right about something. Haven't you ever had an argument?" Zaratiel considered this question seriously. "No one argues with me. When I express an opinion, others either agree or remain silent. When I make a decision, it is implemented. That must be incredibly lonely." The words hung in the air between them, and Marcus immediately regretted his directness. But, instead of taking offense, the princess looked at him with something that might have been gratitude. "I had never thought of it in those terms," she said quietly. "But, yes, I suppose it is." Their dinner arrived via automated service, simple foods beautifully prepared, but without the elaborate presentation that usually accompanied royal meals. As they ate, Marcus began asking questions that no one had ever thought to ask the princess before. Not about policy or politics or trade agreements, but about her thoughts, her experiences, her observations. "What's the strangest planet you've ever visited?" "Zirion Prime," she answered without hesitation. The inhabitants evolved from crystalline formations, and their entire civilization exists in frequencies of light that most species can't perceive. I spent 3 days learning to see them properly, and, when I finally managed it. She paused, a smile crossing her face. It was like discovering that color had been invented. "That's amazing. What did you talk about with them?" "Mathematics, mostly. They experience numbers as physical spaces they can navigate. They tried to show me what the square root of -1 looks like, but I think the translation was lost somewhere." Marcus leaned forward, genuinely interested. Did you figure out any way to bridge that gap? Between how they perceive mathematics and how more conventional species understand it. For the next hour, they discussed mathematical philosophy, translation theory, and the challenges of communication between radically different forms of consciousness. Zaratil found herself speaking more freely than she had in decades, sharing ideas and insights that she had never had reason to discuss with anyone else. She also found herself asking questions in return. Where did humans go? She asked as they shared a dessert made from crystallized starlight. The historical records show traces of your species throughout this galaxy nearly 1,000 years ago, and then, nothing. Marcus was quiet for a moment, staring up at the real stars that were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. We almost destroyed ourselves, he said finally. Classic story, really. We developed faster than light travel before we developed the wisdom to use it responsibly. We spread across the galaxy like a plague, taking what we wanted, fighting wars over resources that didn't belong to us, making enemies faster than we could count them. What changed? We lost. Badly. A coalition of 17 species got together and decided that humanity was too dangerous to exist in civilized space. They didn't try to exterminate us, they just evicted us. Gave us a choice: leave the galaxy voluntarily, or be driven out by force. Zaratil studied his face in the soft light from the crystalline flowers. You don't seem bitter about it. Why would I be? They were right. We were dangerous, and we were getting worse. The exile was the best thing that could have happened to us. How so? Marcus smiled, and she was beginning to recognize that particular expression, the one that appeared when he was about to say something that challenged her assumptions about the universe. Because it forced us to grow up. When you can't solve your problems by taking things from other people, you have to learn to solve them by becoming better people. We spent 800 years in the void between galaxies, learning how to be human without being horrible. We developed new technologies, new philosophies, new ways of thinking about our place in the universe. And, when we finally decided we were ready to come home, we discovered something interesting. Which was? We didn't want to conquer anyone anymore. We just wanted to understand them. The princess set down her glass of liquid light and looked at this impossible human who had somehow managed to make her feel more alive in one evening than she had felt in 3 centuries of royal protocols. Is that what you're trying to do with me? She asked. Understand me? I'd like to try, Marcus said simply. If you'll let me. For a long moment, they sat in comfortable silence, listening to the soft music that the crystalline trees made when the evening wind passed through their branches. Around them, the garden glowed with its own inner light, creating a pocket of peace in the vast complexity of her empire. Marcus, she said finally, may I ask you something that might be improper? Go ahead. Why aren't you afraid of me? He considered the question seriously. Should I be? Everyone else is. Even the ones who want to marry me, even the ones who love me from a distance, they're all afraid of what I might do, what I might decide, how I might react. They treat me like a force of nature rather than a person. You are powerful enough to be a force of nature, Marcus said. But that doesn't mean you can't also be a person. The two aren't mutually exclusive. But you don't seem intimidated by the power. Marcus shrugged. Power is just a tool. It's like being afraid of someone because they have a really good hammer. Sure, they could build amazing things or destroy things with it, but the hammer isn't what makes them who they are. What makes them who they are is what they choose to build or destroy. And what do you think I've chosen to build? An empire where 12 different species live in peace. A civilization where art and science flourish. A galaxy where conflicts are resolved through diplomacy rather than warfare. You've built something beautiful, princess. The fact that you have the power to make it all just makes the fact that you choose not to more impressive. Zaratil felt something shift inside her chest, something warm and unfamiliar. She was accustomed to being praised for her beauty, her wisdom, her strength. But no one had ever praised her for her choices, her restraint, her decision to use her power to create rather than destroy. You're very strange, Marcus Chen, she said softly. Thank you. That wasn't necessarily a compliment. I know. They shared another smile, and the princess realized that somewhere during this impossible evening, she had stopped thinking of this human as a curiosity or a diplomatic challenge. She was thinking of him as something far more dangerous. She was thinking of him as a friend. As the night deepened around them, they continued talking, their conversation ranging from philosophy to art to the practical challenges of running an interstellar empire. For the first time in centuries, Zaratiel found herself losing track of time, forgetting about her schedule, ignoring the gentle chimes from her communicator that indicated she had other obligations waiting. She was discovering what it felt like to simply enjoy someone's company. And she was beginning to understand why that might be the most dangerous discovery of all. Of the morning after their dinner brought an emergency session of the Galactic Council, and Princess Zaratiel found herself in the familiar position of mediating a dispute between civilizations that should have been advanced enough to solve their own problems. Today's crisis involved the Methane Confederacy and the Silicon Collective, two species so fundamentally different that they couldn't agree on basic concepts like up and existence. The conference room was filled with representatives from both sides, their translators working overtime to convert thoughts into concepts that the other species could comprehend. The methane beings existed primarily as gas clouds with fluctuating consciousness, while the Silicon Collective were crystalline structures that thought in geological timescales. Watching them attempt to negotiate was like watching clouds argue with mountains. The Confederacy maintains, bubbled Representative Nexthal through his atmospheric suit, that the disputed system belongs to us by right of first consciousness. We were aware of those planets before the collective had even formed their first coherent thought. Consciousness, replied Delegate Cortel, her crystal form resonating with harmonics that took several seconds to translate, is not the measure of claim. The planets in question formed from stellar materials that originated in our home system. They are, quite literally, our children. Zaratiel rubbed her temples, feeling the familiar weight of cosmic-scale politics settling on her shoulders. These disputes could go on for centuries if left unresolved, and both species had the capacity to make life very difficult for the other 11 members of the galactic community. Perhaps, she began, falling into the diplomatic tone that had become as natural as breathing, we could establish a joint commission to excuse me, came a voice from the back of the room, but I have a question. Every head in the chamber turned to stare at Marcus Chen, who had somehow entered the supposedly secure conference room and was now leaning against the wall with casual interest. The guards moved toward him, but Zaratiel held up a hand to stop them. Mr. Chen, she said carefully, this is a closed session. I know, and I'm sorry for interrupting, Marcus said, not sounding sorry at all. But I was listening to your debate, and I'm confused about something fundamental. This is highly irregular, began Advisor Peldar. It's fine, the princess said, surprising herself. What's your question, Marcus? He stepped forward, his hands in his pockets, looking for all the world like he was asking about the weather rather than potentially disrupting a negotiation that could affect billions of lives. Well, it sounds like you're both claiming ownership of a solar system based on two completely different concepts of what ownership means. The Confederacy is claiming consciousness priority, and the collective is claiming material origin. But, has anyone asked what the planets themselves want? The silence that followed was so complete that the only sound was the soft humming of the translation matrices trying to process concepts that didn't exist in most galactic languages. The planets? Representative Nexthal's gas cloud swirled in confused patterns. Planets do not have wants. They are not conscious beings. Are you sure? Marcus asked. According to the historical records I've been reading, both of your species have encountered various forms of planetary consciousness before. Rock singers, Gaiamines, crystal networks that span entire continents. How do you know these particular planets aren't thinking beings in their own right? Delegate Cortel's crystal structure began resonating at frequencies that made the air shimmer. Even if they were conscious, which is highly unlikely, they would not have the capacity to understand concepts of interstellar politics. Maybe not, Marcus agreed. But they might have preferences about who gets to live on them. They might have opinions about whether they want to host methane refineries or crystal gardens. They might even have ideas about what kind of civilization would be best for their long-term health. He paused, looking around the room at the assembled representatives. I mean, if someone was going to decide where you got to live and what got built in your backyard, wouldn't you want them to at least ask your opinion first? Princess Zaratiel stared at the human who had somehow managed to reframe a territorial dispute as a question of planetary rights. It was ridiculous. It was impractical. It was completely outside any established diplomatic precedent. It was also brilliant. "You're suggesting," she said slowly, "that we attempt to communicate with the planets themselves before making any decisions about their governance." "I'm suggesting that maybe ownership isn't the right concept at all," Marcus replied. "Maybe what you need isn't a property dispute resolution, but a conversation about what kind of partnership would work best for everyone involved, including the planets." Representative Nexthal's gas cloud was now cycling through colors that didn't exist in most species' visual spectrums. This is not how territorial disputes are resolved. There are protocols. There are established procedures. "Sure," Marcus said. "And how well have those protocols worked out for everyone? How many similar disputes are currently pending in your courts? How many civilizations are currently upset with each other over resource allocation and territorial claims?" The uncomfortable silence that followed answered his question more clearly than words could have. "What exactly are you proposing?" asked Delegate Quartel. "I'm proposing that you try something different," Marcus said. "Send joint scientific missions to the disputed planets. Not mining surveys or colonization assessments, but actual communication attempts. See if you can establish contact. Find out what the planets need, what they can offer, what kind of relationship they'd prefer. Then, build your agreement around that. And, if the planets are not conscious? Then, you've learned something valuable about the nature of planetary formation in that region of space, and you can proceed with more information than you had before. But, if they are conscious?" Marcus smiled. "Well, then, you might discover that the real question isn't who gets to own them, but whether they'd like to join the galactic community as members rather than territory." The idea hung in the air like a new star being born, bright and strange and full of possibilities that no one had considered before. Around the conference table, representatives from two ancient civilizations stared at the human who had just suggested that they completely rethink their fundamental assumptions about consciousness, ownership, and what constituted a valid citizen of the galaxy. "This is unprecedented," whispered Pelvar. "Everything important is unprecedented at first," Marcus replied. Princess Zaratiel found herself leaning forward in her chair, her mind racing through the implications of what Marcus was suggesting. It was audacious to the point of insanity. It challenged legal frameworks that had been in place for millennia. It could potentially revolutionize how the galactic community thought about everything from territorial expansion to resource management to the basic question of what constituted life itself. "Representative Nexthal, Delegate Quartel," she said formally, "I propose a 30-day recess to allow your respective governments to consider this alternative approach. If both parties agree, we will establish a joint commission to attempt planetary communication protocols, with the understanding that any agreements reached will be subject to the consent of all conscious parties involved." The methane being and the crystal delegate exchanged what might have been glances if either of them had possessed anything resembling eyes. "The Confederacy will consider this proposal," Nexthal finally bubbled. "The collective finds the concept intriguing," Quartel resonated. "We will convey it to our deep thinkers." As the session adjourned and the representatives filed out, Princess Zaratiel found herself alone with Marcus in the vast conference room. She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "That was either the most brilliant piece of diplomacy I've ever witnessed, or the most dangerous," she said. "Hopefully both," Marcus replied. "The best ideas usually are." "You realize what you've potentially started? If this works, if we actually manage to establish communication with planetary consciousnesses, it will change everything. Every territorial agreement, every colonial charter, every assumption about life and consciousness in the galaxy." "Would that be a bad thing?" She considered the question seriously. "It would be complicated. There are millions of established settlements on worlds that were never tested for consciousness. There are entire economies built on resource extraction from planets that might turn out to be thinking beings. The legal implications alone could take centuries to sort through. But, think about the possibilities," Marcus said, his eyes bright with enthusiasm. "What if some of those planets want to be partners instead of resources?
What if they have insights about sustainable development, about long-term ecological planning, about ways of living that don't require destroying the environment? What if they've been trying to communicate with their inhabitants for millennia, but no one ever thought to listen?
Zaratiel walked to the great window that looked out over her capital city, watching the traffic streams of flying vehicles weave between towers that reached toward the stars.
You're suggesting that my entire civilization might be built on a misunderstanding.
I'm suggesting that your entire civilization might be about to become more interesting. She turned back to him, and he could see the conflict playing out behind her violet eyes. The weight of responsibility, the fear of unintended consequences, the excitement of genuine discovery.
Why? She asked suddenly. Why do you care about resolving disputes between species you've never met over planets you'll never see? What do you gain from any of this? Marcus was quiet for a moment, considering his answer.
800 years ago, my people were exiled from this galaxy because we thought the universe existed for our convenience. We took what we wanted without asking, we solved problems with force instead of understanding, and we never considered that other forms of life might have perspectives worth hearing. He gestured toward the window, toward the city beyond, toward the vast complexity of the galactic civilization that surrounded them.
You built something different.
You built a community where different species work together, where conflicts are resolved through discussion instead of warfare, where the strong protect the weak instead of exploiting them.
But I think you could build something even better. Better how? More inclusive. More creative. More alive.
Marcus moved to stand beside her at the window.
You've created peace between thinking species, which is incredible. But what if you could create partnership with every form of consciousness in the galaxy? What if you could build a civilization that listened to everyone, not just the ones who look like they should have opinions?
Princess Zaratiel stared out at her empire, seeing it suddenly, through new eyes. Every world, every system, every seemingly empty region of space filled with possibilities she had never considered.
It was overwhelming and terrifying and absolutely exhilarating. You really think this could work?
I think you're brilliant enough to make it work, Marcus said simply.
The question is whether you're brave enough to try.
That evening, Zaratiel cancelled her scheduled appearances and retreated to her private study, her mind spinning with questions and possibilities. She pulled up the historical records on planetary consciousness, diving deep into research she had never had reason to examine before. The data was fragmentary, scattered across centuries of observations and half-understood encounters, but patterns began to emerge.
There had been signs. Subtle indicators that many worlds possessed some form of awareness.
Geological formations that seemed too organized to be natural, weather patterns that responded to civilizational changes, ecosystems that demonstrated planning and cooperation on scales that suggested planetary intelligence. All dismissed as coincidence, as the result of complex but unconscious natural processes.
What if they had been wrong?
Her communications system chimed with an incoming message, and she looked up to see Marcus's face in the holographic display. He was in his quarters, but instead of the formal diplomatic setting she had expected, he appeared to be sitting on the floor with what looked like a collection of mechanical parts spread out around him.
"Sorry to bother you," he said, "but I wanted to thank you for backing me up in the conference today. I probably should have asked permission before jumping into your negotiation."
"What are you building?" she asked, curiosity overriding diplomacy. Marcus looked down at the components around him and grinned.
"Communication array.
I've been thinking about your planetary consciousness problem, and I realized that most species try to communicate with other consciousnesses using methods that work for them.
But what if planetary consciousness operates on completely different principles?" "What do you mean?"
"Well, planets think slowly, right?
Geological timescales. So maybe they communicate slowly too.
Maybe we've been trying to have conversations at the wrong speed." He held up a device that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts.
"This is designed to detect very low-frequency communication patterns, signals that might take days or weeks to complete a single thought."
Zaratiel found herself leaning forward.
"You built this tonight? Humans are good at improvising. It's one of our better traits." Marcus's expression grew more serious.
"But I want you to know, Princess, I'm not trying to change your civilization without permission. If this makes you uncomfortable, if you'd rather handle the planetary consciousness issue through established channels, I'll back off.
This is your galaxy, not mine. She was quiet for a long moment, studying his face in the blue light of the holographic projection.
Here was someone who could have pushed his advantage, who could have tried to make himself indispensable to her decision-making process, who could have used his insights to gain influence over her empire.
Instead, he was offering to step back. "Marcus," she said finally, "would you like to test your communication array tomorrow?
I know of a planet in the outer rim that has always shown unusual characteristics.
It might be an interesting place to start."
His smile was like watching a sunrise.
"I would love that."
As she ended the communication, Princess Zaratiel realized that somewhere between yesterday's dinner and today's diplomatic revolution, something fundamental had shifted in her universe. For the first time in 3 centuries, she was genuinely excited about tomorrow. More concerning, for the first time in her life, she was beginning to understand what her countless suitors had been feeling when they looked at her with such desperate hope. The difference was that Marcus wasn't hoping for her hand in marriage. He was hoping for her friendship. And she was beginning to realize that might be infinitely more dangerous. The planet Thyss Andra floated in space like a jewel made of dreams, its surface swirling with colors that had no names in any known language. It was a small world, barely large enough to hold an atmosphere, orbiting a dying star in a system that most galactic maps marked as uninhabited. But Princess Zaratiel had visited it once during her early years, and something about it had stayed with her across the centuries. The ship they took was small and fast, designed for diplomatic missions rather than military operations. Just the 2 of them, plus a minimal crew who had been sworn to absolute secrecy about their destination. As they approached the planet's atmosphere, Marcus was pressed against the viewport like a child seeing the ocean for the first time. "It's beautiful," he breathed. "What causes those color patterns?" "No one knows," Zaratiel replied, settling beside him to watch their approach. "Spectral analysis shows elements that shouldn't be able to exist in combination, arranged in patterns that seem to shift when we're not directly observing them.
Most scientists classify it as an interesting mineral curiosity. Most scientists haven't tried talking to it."
The landing was smooth, their ship touching down in a clearing surrounded by crystal formations that hummed with their own inner music. As they stepped out onto the planet's surface, Marcus immediately began assembling his communication array, his movements quick and efficient despite the improvised nature of his equipment.
Zaratiel found herself watching him work rather than examining the alien landscape around them.
There was something hypnotic about his complete focus, the way his hands moved with practiced certainty even when dealing with technology he had built from spare parts. She realized she had never seen anyone approach a problem with such uncomplicated enthusiasm. "Okay," Marcus said, making final adjustments to a device that looked like it should have been a sculpture rather than scientific equipment.
"I'm reading some very low-frequency vibrations. Rhythmic patterns that seem almost like they might be intentional. Can you translate them?"
"Not exactly translate, but maybe." He paused, his fingers dancing over controls that seemed to respond to his touch in ways that defied conventional physics. "I can try to synchronize our communication speed with theirs. Think of it like learning to speak very, very slowly." He activated something, and, suddenly, the air around them began to shimmer. Not visibly, but in a way that made Zaratiel's consciousness feel like it was expanding, stretching across time and space in ways that her mind could barely process. And then, like the first light of dawn breaking over an infinite horizon, something spoke.
It wasn't words. It wasn't even concepts that could be easily translated into language.
It was pure meaning, flowing directly into their minds with the weight and depth of geological time. The communication carried flavors of curiosity, loneliness, and something that might have been joy. Small quick bright ones, "Come again finally," then waiting singing hoping, **. Marcus and Zaratiel looked at each other, both struggling to process what they had just experienced. The princess felt tears streaming down her face, though she wasn't sure why. The emotion in that first contact had been overwhelming, not the cold intelligence she might have expected from a planetary consciousness, but something warm and desperately lonely. "Hello," Marcus said aloud, his voice shaking slightly. We can hear you. We're sorry it took so long." The response came like a gentle earthquake, vibrating through the ground beneath their feet and through their bones and into the deepest parts of their minds. No sorry needed, time different for us, small quick ones, live fast bright brief, we understand, but grateful for listening, asterisk you've been trying to communicate before, Zaratiel said, finding her voice.
How long?
Since, first small ones came, many cycles ago, tried to sing with them, but they could not hear, built colors in sky, changed patterns in stone, hoped they would understand, but they took samples and left, asterisk the princess felt something breaking apart inside her chest. This ancient being had been trying to communicate for centuries, painting its thoughts across its own surface, arranging its very substance into messages that no one had bothered to interpret as anything more than interesting geological phenomena.
What do you need? She asked. How can we help?
The pause that followed lasted long enough for Marcus to check his equipment, wondering if the connection had been lost. But, then, the response came, carrying with it a sensation of surprise so profound that it made the air itself seem to hold its breath.
Help us?
No small quick ones ask how to help, always ask how we can help them, want our minerals, our crystals, our space for building, but you ask how to help us, asterisk of course we ask how to help, Marcus said.
You're a person. People help each other.
Person, asterisk the concept seemed to ripple through the planet's consciousness like water over stone.
Asterisk we are, person? Not resource? Not territory?
Person, asterisk you think, you feel, you communicate, Zaratiel said softly.
What else would you be?
What followed could only be described as planetary laughter, a deep, resonant joy that made the crystal formations around them sing in harmony and caused the aurora-like colors in the atmosphere to dance in patterns of pure delight. Person, yes, we are person, have been person, but no one asked, no one listened, thought perhaps wrong about being person, asterisk they spent the next several hours in conversation, learning about a form of consciousness so different from their own that it challenged every assumption they held about intelligence and awareness.
Thysandra thought in centuries and felt emotions that lasted for millennia.
Its memories stretched back to the formation of the star system, and its dreams were of watching new worlds grow and civilizations bloom across the galaxy. But what struck both Marcus and Zaratiel most profoundly was the planet's essential loneliness. It had been aware of life throughout the galaxy for eons, watching the rise and fall of civilizations, seeing the development of space travel and interstellar communication, but always as an observer, never as a participant.
There are others like you, Zaratiel said as the local sun began to set, painting the sky in colors that seemed to respond to the planet's emotional state. Other worlds that might be conscious. We could try to establish communication networks between you. You wouldn't have to be alone anymore. Others, like us? Really truly, asterisk we think so. We're planning to find out. Would others want to speak with us?
Even though we think slow, feel slow, live slow, asterisk Marcus smiled, adjusting his communication array to better synchronize with the planet's rhythm of thought.
I think they've been as lonely as you have. I think they've been waiting for someone to listen to them too.
As they prepared to leave, Thysandra had one final communication for them, and this one carried emotional undertones that made Zaratiel's heart ache with their intensity. Small quick bright princess, small quick brave human, you have given us gift beyond measure, not just communication, but recognition, acknowledgement, being seen. Thank you, we'll sing your names in our crystal songs for all time, asterisk thank you for trusting us to listen, Zaratiel replied. Thank you for being patient with us while we learned how. The flight back to her home world was conducted mostly in silence, both of them lost in thought as they processed what they had experienced.
It was only as they entered the palace's landing bay that Marcus finally spoke. Everything's different now, isn't it?
Everything, she agreed.
Are you ready for that? For all the changes this is going to bring?
Zaratiel turned to look at him, this impossible human who had walked into her life and turned her entire understanding of the universe upside down in the space of a few days.
I don't know. Are you? I'm terrified, Marcus said honestly. This is so much bigger than I thought it would be when I first suggested planetary communication.
We're talking about fundamentally changing how the galaxy thinks about consciousness, about citizenship, about what it means to be alive.
People are going to resist. Governments are going to panic.
There will be legal challenges, political upheavals, maybe even conflicts between species who can't agree on how to handle this.
But, you still think it's worth doing?
Marcus looked out at the lights of the capital city, millions of beings from dozens of different species living and working together in ways that would have been impossible just a few centuries ago. I think it's like what you've already built here. Hard, complicated, sometimes dangerous, but absolutely worth it. And, I think. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. I think you're the only person in the galaxy who could make it work. Why me? Because you've spent 3 centuries learning how to bridge differences between species that have almost nothing in common. Because you've built a civilization based on cooperation instead of conquest. Because when I suggested something completely insane, you didn't dismiss it, you found a way to test it. He smiled. And, because you're the first person Thyssandra ever called friend. They were walking through the palace corridors now, heading toward their respective quarters, but Zaratiel found herself reluctant to end the conversation. Something had changed between them during their time on the planet, something she couldn't quite name but could feel settling around her heart like warmth. Marcus, she said as they reached the intersection where their paths diverged, tomorrow I'm going to call an emergency session of the Galactic Council. I'm going to propose the establishment of a new diplomatic corps dedicated to identifying and communicating with planetary consciousnesses. I'm going to suggest fundamental changes to how we define citizenship and consciousness in the galactic community. That's going to cause a storm. Yes, it is. She looked at him directly. I want you there. Not as an observer, not as a guest, but as my partner in this. As someone who understands what we're trying to build. The word partner hung in the air between them, carrying implications that neither of them was quite ready to examine too closely. Are you sure? Marcus asked. I'm not a diplomat. I don't know your protocols or your politics. I might make things worse. You might, she agreed. But, you also might help me see solutions that I would miss on my own. You have a talent for asking the questions that no one else thinks to ask. And, if this destroys everything? If the Council refuses to accept the changes, if species start withdrawing from the galactic community, if everything you've built comes apart? Princess Zaratiel considered the question seriously, thinking about the lonely planet they had just left, about the centuries of attempted communication that had gone unheard, about all the other worlds that might be waiting for someone to finally listen. Then, at least we'll have tried to build something better, she said. And, at least we'll have done it together. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and she could see him weighing the magnitude of what she was asking. Not just his participation in a political revolution, but his partnership in potentially reshaping the fundamental structure of galactic civilization. All right, he said finally. Partners. As they said goodnight and went their separate ways, neither of them acknowledged the fact that somewhere between dinner in the garden and today's conversation with a lonely planet, the nature of their relationship had fundamentally changed. They weren't just a princess and her unusual guest anymore. They weren't just allies in a diplomatic revolution. They were something more dangerous and more precious than either of them had planned on. They were falling in love. And, tomorrow, they would face the galaxy together. The emergency session of the Galactic Council was unlike anything in the recorded history of interstellar diplomacy. Representatives from 12 species filled the Great Chamber, their various forms of communication creating a symphony of sounds, lights, and electromagnetic frequencies that would have been overwhelming to any single species experiencing it alone. But, today, the usual controlled chaos of galactic politics was replaced by something unprecedented: absolute silence. Princess Zaratiel stood before the assembled representatives, her formal robes shimmering with the light of captured stars, but her voice carrying a warmth and conviction that transcended mere ceremony. Beside her, Marcus Chen looked profoundly out of place in his simple human clothing, yet somehow managed to project an aura of calm confidence that commanded attention. Honored representatives, the princess began, her words translated simultaneously into dozens of languages and communication methods. Today we gather to discuss a discovery that will fundamentally change our understanding of consciousness, citizenship, and our place in the universe. She gestured, and the air above the assembly filled with holographic recordings from their visit to Thyssandra. The planetary consciousness's voice echoed through the chamber, its deep, geological tones carrying emotions that transcended species barriers. Several representatives shifted uncomfortably as they heard, for the first time, a planet speak of loneliness, hope, and the desperate desire for connection. When the recording ended, the silence stretched for nearly a full minute before Ambassador Veltar of the Helix Federation finally found her voice. "Your Majesty," she said, her crystalline form resonating with harmonics of disbelief, "are you suggesting that we have been inadvertently ignoring entire categories of conscious beings for millennia?" "I am suggesting," Zaratiel replied, "that consciousness may be far more diverse and widespread than we have ever imagined. And I am proposing that we have a moral obligation to investigate, to listen, and to offer full citizenship in the galactic community to any being capable of communication and self-determination." The eruption that followed was immediate and predictable. 12 different species began arguing simultaneously, their various forms of communication creating a cacophony of competing concerns. Questions of legal precedent, resource allocation, territorial sovereignty, and practical implementation flew through the air like weapons in a battle. Marcus watched the chaos with fascination rather than alarm, noting the patterns of objection and the underlying fears that drove them. When Princess Zaratiel looked at him questioningly, he nodded slightly and stepped forward. "May I address the assembly?" he asked, his human voice somehow carrying over the din of alien arguments. The chamber gradually quieted as representatives remembered the strange being who had somehow convinced their princess to propose such radical changes. Marcus waited until he had complete attention before speaking. "I understand your concerns," he said simply. "You're worried about legal complications, economic disruptions, and the practical challenges of integrating planetary consciousnesses into a governmental system designed for mobile species. These are valid concerns, and they deserve careful consideration." Nods of agreement rippled through the assembly. "But I want you to consider something else," Marcus continued. "Every species in this room was once unknown to the others. Every alliance, every trade agreement, every moment of cooperation between your civilizations started with someone deciding that the benefits of connection outweighed the risks of change." He gestured toward the holographic display that still showed images of THYSS Andra. "That planet has been aware of galactic civilization for over 1,000 years. It has watched your species develop space travel, establish trade routes, build the very council that governs this assembly. And, for all that time, it has been trying to participate, trying to contribute, trying to be part of something larger than itself. But, the practical implications," began Representative Thexmol of the quantum streams. "Are manageable," Marcus interrupted gently. "Princess Zaratiel isn't proposing that we immediately grant planetary citizenship to every world in the galaxy. She's proposing that we establish protocols for identification and communication with potential planetary consciousnesses, and that we develop legal frameworks for voluntary participation in the galactic community." He paused, letting that sink in before continuing. "Think about what these beings might offer. Planetary consciousnesses think on geological timescales. They have perspectives on sustainable development, climate management, and long-term ecosystem planning that no other form of life could provide. They might hold keys to technologies, to ways of thinking, to solutions for problems we haven't even identified yet. And if they refuse cooperation," asked Ambassador Creden of the Starforge Collective, "if they decide that organic life is a plague to be eliminated?" Marcus smiled, and something about that expression seemed to calm the assembly's fears. "Then, we negotiate, just like we do with any other conscious being. We find compromises, establish boundaries, build relationships based on mutual respect and benefit. The same skills that have made this galactic community possible in the first place." Princess Zaratiel watched the faces around the assembly hall as Marcus spoke, seeing the gradual shift from panic to consideration to something that might even be cautious enthusiasm. He had a gift for making radical changes seem not just possible, but inevitable. More than that, he had a talent for helping people see the best possible version of themselves in the face of uncertainty. "There is another consideration," she said, stepping forward to stand beside Marcus. "The humans have returned to our galaxy after 800 years of exile, bringing with them perspectives and technologies that we had thought lost forever. They offer us not just new ways of thinking about planetary consciousness, but new approaches to the challenges we face as a galactic community." She looked directly at Marcus, and something passed between them that the entire assembly could see, even if they couldn't interpret it. I propose that we establish a joint commission to investigate planetary consciousness throughout our territory. I propose that we develop new categories of citizenship that can accommodate non-mobile forms of life. And I propose that we invite the human colonial fleet to return to the galaxy as full members of our community. The silence that followed was different from the earlier quiet. This was not the silence of shock or confusion, but the silence of profound consideration. Around the chamber, representatives began consulting with their advisors, accessing databases, running calculations on the potential implications of what was being proposed. Finally, Elder Morthess of the Deep Void Collective spoke, her ancient voice carrying the weight of millennia. "Princess Zaratiel," she said slowly, "you are asking us to fundamentally reshape our understanding of life, consciousness, and community. You are asking us to take risks that could destabilize everything we have built together." "I am," the princess replied honestly. "And, yet," the elder continued, "every great advance in galactic civilization has required exactly such courage. The original alliance between our species was considered impossible. The development of universal translation protocols was thought to be fantasy. The establishment of peaceful trade routes across the galaxy was dismissed as naive idealism." She paused, her dark form shifting in patterns that indicated deep thought. "The collective agrees to participate in this investigation. We propose a trial period of 1 solar cycle, during which joint missions will attempt communication with selected worlds throughout our territory. If successful contact is established, we will reconvene to discuss implementation of appropriate citizenship protocols." One by one, the other representatives added their agreement, some enthusiastic, others cautious, but all willing to explore the possibilities that Marcus and Zaratiel had presented. By the end of the session, the galactic community had officially committed to the most ambitious expansion of consciousness recognition in the history of interstellar civilization. As the representatives filed out, already beginning the complex process of organizing unprecedented diplomatic missions, Princess Zaratiel and Marcus found themselves alone in the vast chamber. "We did it," she said softly, hardly believing it herself. "You did it," Marcus corrected. "I just asked the right questions." "We did it together," she insisted, turning to face him fully. "And we're going to continue doing it together, aren't we? The missions, the negotiations, the complications that are inevitably going to arise when we start finding out just how many planetary consciousnesses are out there waiting for us to listen?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, studying her face in the soft light of the chamber's crystalline walls. "Zara, there's something I need to tell you. Something about why I really came here." Her heart skipped, and, for a moment she feared that everything they had shared was about to be revealed as some elaborate deception. "The human colonial fleet is real," he continued quickly, seeing her expression. "And everything I told you about our exile and our development in the void is true. But the reason I volunteered for this mission, the reason I asked to come here specifically, it wasn't just because I thought you might be receptive to new ideas about consciousness and communication." "Then, why?" Marcus took a deep breath, and she could see him gathering courage for something that was clearly more terrifying to him than addressing the Galactic Council had been. 800 years ago, when my people were exiled from this galaxy, there were stories. Legends about a princess whose beauty could stop wars, whose wisdom could unite species that had nothing in common, whose heart was as vast as space itself but protected by walls that no one could breach. He stepped closer to her, his dark eyes holding hers. "I came here because I wanted to meet the most interesting person in the galaxy. I came here because I was curious about someone who had supposedly never met her equal. And," she whispered. "And I discovered that the legends got it completely wrong," Marcus said softly. "You're not untouchable. You're not unbreachable. You're not even particularly interested in being the most powerful person in the room." He reached out tentatively, and she didn't pull away when his fingers touched hers. "You're something much more dangerous than the myths suggested," he continued. "You're brilliant and curious and brave and kind. You laugh at unexpected things and you listen to ideas that would terrify most people and you care more about doing what's right than about what's safe or traditional or politically expedient." "Marcus, I'm in love with you," he said simply. "Not with the princess, not with the power or the position or the impossible beauty. I'm in love with the person who spent an evening arguing about mathematics and philosophy, who was willing to risk her entire political foundation on the chance that a lonely planet might have something to say, who looked at the most fundamental assumptions of galactic civilization and decided they needed to be changed. The words hung in the air between them, as transformative and dangerous as anything they had said to the Galactic Council. Princess Zaratiel felt her carefully constructed walls crumbling, not from assault but from the simple recognition that someone really saw her as she truly was. "I've been in love with you since our first dinner," she whispered. "And I've been terrified of it since the moment I realized it was happening." "Why terrified?" "Because everything I am, everything I've built, is based on being untouchable. If I allow myself to love someone, if I allow someone to truly know me, then I become vulnerable. And if I'm vulnerable, then everything I'm responsible for becomes vulnerable too." Marcus smiled, the same expression that had captured her attention that first day in the throne room. "Zara, love doesn't make you weaker. It makes you braver. It gives you something worth protecting that goes beyond duty or obligation or political necessity." "How can you be so certain?" "Because that's what you've already done. You fell in love with the possibility of communicating with planetary consciousnesses, and that love made you willing to risk everything you'd built to make it happen. You fell in love with the idea of a more inclusive galaxy, and that love gave you the courage to challenge thousands of years of legal precedent." He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his presence, could see the absolute sincerity in his eyes. "Love isn't your weakness, princess. It's your superpower." When she kissed him, it was with the force of 3 centuries of suppressed longing, of walls finally crumbling, of a heart that had been locked away discovering what it meant to be free. Around them, the crystals in the chamber walls began to sing in harmonies that had never been heard before, as if the very palace was celebrating this moment of connection. They broke apart finally, both breathless, both transformed by the acknowledgement of what had been building between them since that first impossible dinner. "So," Zaratiel said, her forehead resting against his, "where does this leave us? A princess and a human, trying to revolutionize galactic civilization while figuring out how to be in love?" "I think," Marcus replied, "it leaves us with the most interesting problem in the galaxy to solve together." "And if it all falls apart? If the planetary consciousness project fails, if the political alliances crumble, if loving each other destroys everything we've worked for?" Marcus smiled, that expression that had started this entire impossible journey. "Then, at least we'll have loved each other while we try to change the universe. I can't think of a better way to fail." She laughed, the sound echoing off the crystal walls like music. "You realize this is going to complicate everything? Royal marriages are typically strategic alliances, not love matches between species that were supposed to be extinct." "Good thing we're already revolutionizing galactic tradition," Marcus pointed out. "We might as well be thorough about it." 6 months later, the wedding of Princess Zaratielen.